Cops and other law enforcement people have read it. What were some cases you worked on that made you think, even if for a moment, that something supernatural/paranormal was going on? Episode 5. I am a police officer in Alaska. I work nights and was on the outskirts of town. I and 2 other officers responded to a family's house where they heard someone howling like a wolf under their back deck. When I was on my way, another officer called me and said that he had been to the neighbor's house earlier. The department had had a few problems with the neighbor where he had called several times saying someone was breaking into his house, but there was no one there and there was no sign of anyone being there, no tracks in fresh snow. That night the neighbor thought that someone was breaking into his house. He called the police officers and went outside to confront the person. When he went outside he didn't find anyone, and though he saw someone in his window, he shot at his own house. When the police got there, there was no evidence of someone going into the house. The general consensus was that the neighbor was weird. So, while we were going to the call we thought the weird neighbor had gone under the deck and was howling. When we got there we spoke to the homeowner, and they asked us to walk around the house. We didn't find any footprints. The other officers looked into the woods a little bit and I spoke to the homeowner. They said that they swore they heard howling under their deck. The wife said that a week earlier she saw the police go to the neighbor's house, and when the police walked around the house a skinny man with a dark jacket and long dark hair ran around from the other side of the house and ran into the woods. We looked further into the woods and found tracks that lead to another person's house, then further into the woods where we lost the trail. We told them to lock their doors and to call us next time they heard or saw anything. Maybe the neighbor wasn't weird. Wildland firefighter. Once around 2 a.m. on a smaller lightning fire that was only like a half acre, the crew and I were taking a break from mopping up, chasing hotspots. Then all of a sudden above the next ridge over probably about 1 to 2 miles as the crow flies we see a large orange glowing light slowly moving from east to west. Someone spots it and thinks it's a plane at low altitudes possibly running infrared to search for fires not found in the day. But another points out that the lights aren't flashing and something about planes being required to have 2 colors for identification. It could be a satellite. Someone says. But it's orange and moving too slow, also it's too close to be in orbit. Then it just stops. Holds above the ridge for a few minutes and reverses direction west to east and pauses once more. It held for another few moments and then shot straight up onto space. Not like it changed its direction and headed north. I mean this thing jumped vertically straight up and disappeared. I've never been so excited and scared at the same time. I'm not a police officer, but I did ask a police officer about the scariest thing he ever witnessed. This guy had been around for years and a Vietnam vet. He was working homicide and got a call that there was an apparent suicide, but since it was done with a shotgun they needed to be sure he really shot himself. When he arrived, some other officers had been there a while and it was a bloody mess. The guy put the barrel in his mouth and sprayed the ceiling with his skull. He walked over to the body and looked into the gaping hole in the man's skull. Just then the man grabbed him and jumped up and screamed in his face. The slug the guy used managed to go between both lobes of his brain and not kill him. No one checked if he was alive because he looked very dead. He actually was rushed to the hospital and made it. The police officer told me that was the only time in his adult life he shot himself. Thought he came back from the dead for a moment. An elderly lady phoned 911 and requested that they send some police officers down to her house because she saw a shadowy figure lurking in her backyard. She was living by herself at night and didn't feel safe watching someone through her window. When the police officers arrived, the door was unlocked. They walked in and found the lady seated facing the window and they went to go check the backyard. There were no signs of anyone attempting to break and enter and nothing was missing. She had very tall fences surrounding her property, making it nearly impossible for anyone to get into it. They did, however, find footprints on the inside of her home. It was quite possible that she had left the door unlocked and wasn't looking outside, but rather at a reflection of someone inside of her home, behind her. I'm not in law enforcement or fire/rescue or anything like that. I'm a plumbing contractor and got a call from some homeowners about an unpleasant smell in their house. They were trying to sell the house but were having no luck because prospective homeowners noticed the odor when they entered the master bath. I show up at the site thinking it's a broken vent or main sewer line and the smell is sewer gas or raw sewage coming up from the crawl space. When I entered the home I couldn't smell anything until I got in the master bathroom and then it hit me. It wasn't quite a sewer gas smell. It smelled more like raw sewage mixed with grease trap grease that had been sitting out in the sun on a 90-degree day. I asked the homeowner how to get into the crawl space as I didn't see any access from the outside. The man said he didn't know and had never had to go down there. I started searching the bedroom closets for access and found one in one of the homeowner's daughter's rooms. It was under the carpet and screwed and nailed shut. Here's where it gets freaky. The little girl, whose room the crawl access was in, was watching me as I took up the carpet and was taking out the nails and screws from the access door. She turns to her dad, when I was almost done removing the screws and nails, and frantically starts telling him not to let him out. The dad assumed she was talking about not letting me out and started telling her I wasn't leaving, I was just going under the house. She literally broke down crying and screaming. The homeowner apologized and took her out of the room. When I finally got the access door open, the smell knocked me out. It was terrible. I climbed down in the crawl and worked my way towards the master bath. There was no broken main, no broken vent, no sewage on the ground. In the corner there was a large black trash bag, and when I opened it was full of whole animal carcasses and old bottles of embalming fluid. Freaked me. I hauled man out of there and told them they'll need to call some kind of hazardous waste disposal company to come in and get rid of whatever the hell was down there. I didn't even charge the people, I just got the hell out. A few weeks later I got a call from the same people wanting some minor repairs done in the kitchen so they could sell. The homeowner said after I left the smell completely went away and they had a handy person remove the bag of animal bones they said that had to be the cause of the smell, but it had gone away before the bag was removed, and last time I checked, bones don't smell like that. Never found out what the little girl meant by let him out and never went back there. The guy that lives across from my parents, and who is basically a second father to me, is a fire investigator, and over the years I will go to work fire scenes with him if he needs help. Which seen some pretty wild things, which are some pretty fantastic stories for another time, but this one takes the cake. So, we are on our way down to the scene, which was in Miami, and I was going over the reports to get a feel for what to expect and kept references to an altar, and he said that the cops that had responded earlier told him to expect some real weird thing but not to call them because none of it was actually illegal because they already went over it all. So, we get there and do a quick walk around the property and the home itself is fine, but there is a smaller building at the back that is completely burnt out. So, we knocked on the door and went in and started talking to the owner, and before he told us what happened he asked if we could be sure to have an open mind and not judge him until we heard the whole story, so we both agreed. He proceeds to tell us that he is a priest of some religion that many would refer to as part of the occult. It wasn't voodoo and it wasn't Santeria, I don't remember the name, but I do distinctly remember him saying that you had to have a Catholic Baptist at birth to be a part of it. And when we asked him what started the fire he told us that his enemies put a curse on him and it was spirits that caused the fire, and we both try to keep a straight face and think, okay, that sounds super legit. And then we ask him if we can go check it out and he says sure fine, just be careful because a lot of the things that weren't completely destroyed are irreplaceable. So, we go into the backyard to go start checking out the structure and start using his K9 to search for accelerants, any flammable substances that could be used for arson, and his dog starts whimpering and will not go inside this building, which neither of us have ever seen. We managed to get the dog to go around the building and didn't get any hits, so we put her away and went back and started looking at ourselves. Well, the first thing I start finding are railroad spikes everywhere, which is a little strange, but nothing too crazy. Then I find an old shotgun, and I'm talking like real old. I don't know much about guns, but it looked like pre-World War I, and start thinking that's a little strange. Then we start finding the goat and chicken remains, which I know is used for voodoo, and it is like that, and start getting really weirded out, and the guy I'm helping is even started to get the hereby jibes, and that is when it hits the fan when we find a human skull. We immediately called the police detective back and he said they knew about it, but it wasn't illegal. I have no idea why, but we don't ask questions. According to the homeowner, it belonged to one of his ancestors and it was part of the ceremonies he does. Well, long story short, he couldn't find a reason for the fire to have started. Every idea I threw at him he debunked with the evidence. I forget why candles were ruled out, but there was no electricity running to the back of the building, and it was one of the lowest things in the area, so it couldn't have been lightning. As we were leaving, this dude tells us that he feels terrible that we were forced to enter an area with such terrible dark magic, so he gave us the ingredients and instructions needed to cast some sort of cleansing ritual that involved reading some prayer that he wrote down for us and mixing something called aqua florida with white flower petals and then dumping it over our heads, which we promptly did as soon as we got back home. Easily one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. The guy that lives across from my parents, and who is basically a second father to me, is a fire investigator, and over the years I will go to work fire scenes with him if he needs help. We've seen some pretty wild, which are some pretty fantastic stories for another time, but this one takes the cake. So we are on our way down to the scene, which was in Miami, and I was going over the reports to get a feel for what to expect and kept references to an altar, and he said that the cops that had responded earlier told him to expect some real weird thing but not to call them because none of it was actually illegal because they already went over it all. So, we get there and do a quick walk around the property, and the home itself is fine, but there is a smaller building at the back that is completely burnt out. So, we knocked on the door and went in and started talking to the owner, and before he told us what happened he asked if we could be sure to have an open mind and not judge him until we heard the whole story, so we both agreed. He proceeds to tell us that he is a priest of some religion that many would refer to as part of the occult. It wasn't voodoo and it wasn't Santeria, I don't remember the name, but I do distinctly remember him saying that you had to have a Catholic Baptist at birth to be a part of it. And when we asked him what started the fire, he told us that his enemies put a curse on him and it was spirits that caused the fire, and we both try to keep a straight face and think, okay, that sounds super legit. And then we ask him if we can go check it out, and he says sure, fine, just be careful because a lot of the things that weren't completely destroyed are irreplaceable. So, we go into the backyard to go start checking out the structure and start using his K9 to search for accelerants, any flammable substances that could be used for arson, and his dog starts whimpering and will not go inside this building, which neither of us have ever seen. We managed to get the dog to go around the building and didn't get any hits, so we put her away and went back and started looking at ourselves. Well, the first thing I start finding are railroad spikes everywhere, which is a little strange, but nothing too crazy. Then I find an old shotgun, and I'm talking like real old. I don't know much about guns, but it looked like pre-World War I, and start thinking that's a little strange. Then we start finding the goat and chicken remains, which I know is used for voodoo, and start getting really weirded out, and the guy I'm helping has even started to get the hereby jibes, and that is when it hits the fan when we find a human skull. We immediately called the police detective back and he said they knew about it, but it wasn't illegal. I have no idea why, but we don't ask questions. According to the homeowner, it belonged to one of his ancestors and it was part of the ceremonies he does. Well, long story short, he couldn't find a reason for the fire to have started. Every idea I threw at him he debunked with the evidence. I forget why candles were ruled out, but there was no electricity running to the back of the building, and it was one of the lowest things in the area, so it couldn't have been lightning. As we were leaving, this dude tells us that he feels terrible that we were forced to enter an area with such terrible dark magic, so he gave us the ingredients and instructions needed to cast some sort of cleansing ritual that involved reading some prayer that he wrote down for us and mixing something called aqua florida with white flower petals and then dumping it over our heads, which we promptly did as soon as we got back home. Easily one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. Back in 2011, me and my friend were standing post on the outskirts of RLZ in a small PB in Afghanistan. We were a bit undermanned, so we only had roughly 20 guys on the PB itself. Since this was the case, we stood pretty heinous post hours and ran a skeleton crew throughout the majority of the deployment. On this particular night, me and my friend were standing post at probably about midnight or 1 a.m. He comes over the radio and tells me to check the direction and distance with my NVGs. Now I looked over and radio back saying negative, I have no visual of anything. He tells me to turn on my thermals and recheck. I swear to God, there was a human-shaped figure out in the distance but not moving. Just standing there. I switched back to my NVGs and again, nothing was there. It was starting to make my hair stand up. We called up the COSIC to check on the GBOS camera, but they couldn't see anything. The camera is a much bigger camera, essentially with thermal capability. For the record, I do not believe in paranormal or supernatural activity. Our post lasted about 6 hours and that figure was there on our thermals, not moving the entire time. It wasn't until we got relieved that it disappeared. We just chalked it up to sleep deprivation, but it always stuck with me. That was one of a couple times that weird thing happened out in the sandbox. I was a deputy sheriff for 13 years, and the majority of that time I worked in a large jail with a big population. I was a team leader of the tactical response team that roamed the hallways and responded to all the emergencies that would arise. Not just fights, but medical emergencies too. We had a set of cells in the admissions area that were isolation cells for the inmates who just got there and were problems. Either mentally or physically. Cell 3, I responded one night to a guy who took his pants off and tried hanging himself in the cell. He had a really good attempt and had to be rushed to the hospital. When we review the camera footage to assist with our report, all you notice was him standing quietly in the cell for minutes looking at the camera glitches out, and when it comes back on he's hanging himself. The next 3 days in the same cell had similar incidents. One guy was successful in bashing his head into the wall so hard it killed him. But every time we would watch the tapes, the guy would be standing there watching the camera mince before the attempt, and then the camera glitches. To this day cell 3 still freaks me out. Makes me think there was an entity in that cell causing people to kill themselves. Not Illinois EMT, but that's so weird I thought I would share. This story has been told to me by my grandma, and it's common knowledge in the family, so I have no reason to disbelieve the story. So my granddad discovered in the army he had a gift for hypnosis. Turns out I'm not bad at it either, but far from being a performer, so I guess it runs in the family, so much that by word of mouth he started to become semi-famous, and he was impressive enough to have a producer wanting to sign him for a tour. My granddad declined one, because he had a good enough career as it was too, because he was really tired after performing, so he didn't want to do this too often. After a while hypnotizing people he tried on his sister. She started to have visions and even managed to help her husband to solve a few cases. He was a Lee inspector, while under the spell of her brother. Now here comes the craziest ever, and if it were not coming from my family I would have thought it's pure BS. Once in a while they had sessions with my granddad and her sister just for discovery purposes, and to show off a bit I guess. A doctor comes with his wife. When my grand-aunt is under hypnosis, she tells, this woman has a spot behind her eye and her blood flows backwards. All start to laugh, especially the doctor, who was already thinking everything was BS, and for a while nobody cares. Until the woman gets a tumor in her eye, and when she was examined in the hospital she turned out to have her heart on the right side and pretty much every organ on the opposite from usual side. There are other crazy stories with my granddad and his sis, but not one crazier than this one. I was a police officer for about 5 years. And worked for a boss that used to tell this story all the time. Just a warning, this story contains self-harm, so don't read if that will trigger you. When he was a newcomer and got his first car, they mostly walked back then. He patrolled his district and decided to check out this cemetery area. Kids often went back there, as it was near a skate park, to do extracurricular activities. As he drove up, he saw a person who had hung himself from a tree. He immediately called it in, and the scene was thoroughly investigated. Well, the weird part is, the next night he became curious, so he went back to the same area. The tree was gone. The city had not put in any work orders to cut the tree. The city I worked for did not do that type of thing, as it costs money, and the city was too cheap. There was also no stump in the ground. There was no place the tree could have gone. He was in that spot for about 6 or so hours during the investigation. So, he was familiar with it. It spooked him at the time. Paramedic here. In the middle of the night, we got a call for cardiac arrest, so we responded and walked in with all our stuff, ready to do work. A little old lady answers the door. She is really upset and begging us to help, saying that there's a dead woman on her couch. We walk in, and no one is there. She is so adamant that there's a dead woman in her apartment and that we need to help her. To give her peace of mind, we walk through the apartment with her, even checking closets and whatnot. But as we were opening closets I half expected a body to fall out or to find something. We didn't find anything, but the lady was still really distressed. I spent the rest of the night expecting to go back there because something just felt really off, even though we didn't find anything. Swiss military here, 18-2 Panzer Division. I racked my head for a while trying to remember if any funky things happened during my service, and one finally came to mind. It was during one of my repetition courses. Here you can do something akin to a year, or a shorter recruit school, but have to go back every year for a month for a refreshment course, about 3 or 4 years ago, I believe. As a tanker, we do 3-year rotations between 2 different training spots. One in bore for 2 consequent years, as in a row, not sure if it's the right word, for the pilots to drive on a large terrain, and one in Hinter Rhein for us loaders/shooters to practice our firing technique with the tank. So, this was the year I was stationed in the Hinter Rhein Valley. You can Google map it if you're curious, Hinter Rhein Chesilite if you want a better idea of the layout of the land. Basically, it's a long valley in between mountains, and targets at the end of the 4 kilometers or so length of it. At the entrance of the area, there's a covered hangar where we leave the tanks overnight after service is done on them. Anyhow, it was one of the weekends where my company was to stay on guard duty, and I was, as with all these stories, assigned the night shift between 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. with 2-hour rotations. For those that aren't familiar with the concept, basically you turn on posts every 2 hours. 2 hours at the guard booth, 2h on the sidelines but alert, 2 hours car patrol. Rinse repeat. I was with my college pitch, full name irrelevant, but it's the first letters of his family name, at the guard booth. As it was during the winter period, it was quite chilly to chill outside, so we just sat inside the booth occasionally taking a walk around and radio into base for checkups. Also, since it was nighttime we were issued NVGs, since the valley is rather large and not illuminated they came quite in handy for on-foot patrol. While my mate was keeping warm inside, I took advantage of my Russian heritage and braved the outside for a smoke and a quick scan/patrol of the grounds. With my plus 25 frost resistance, I went on first down the path towards the targets, down valley I guess, having my smoke and generally just scanning the area with a flashlight or the NVGs. I then went back down to the booth, circled around the road and into the hangar. Yes, the hangar. The one filled with a dozen 60-ton war machines and nothing else except a few brooms and dust cloths. Now to paint one more picture, the hangar is mostly straight, but with a slight curve. The parked tanks have about a 1-meter gap between them, and a large 3 or 4 meter gap on the left flank for passage etc. I was feeling cocky I guess. I mean it's Switzerland, we parked and serviced those things barely 4 hours ago. Nothing can go wrong, right? Wrong. I'm used to doing this, I know the sounds they make. I know the sound of a falling tool and can mostly recognize which tool it as well. I know how the air vents that cycle the gases around the hangar sound. I know the dead silence of a night shift when nothing is on too. However, I'm sure most of you also know that feeling of dead air and dread you get when you feel something is wrong as well. This was just it. I remember passing the furthest door into the hangar, 2 entries, both ends, and making my way slowly down the hangar up to where we had parked the tanks for the night. That's when that dead air hit me. It felt wrong. Now I'm not going to talk of shadow people or seeing things from the corner of my eye. Thanks to the 9 circles, I've never yet experienced that. Upon reaching the first row of tanks, I know however I could hear things. Tools to be more precise. A click or 2 of a socket wrench here, a bolt drops there. I thought it was normal, unexpected, but normal. Probably just a tech staying up after hours to fix an urgent issue for somebody that left his phone inside the crew compartment and is trying to get it out while on guard. The tanks often break too, so it made sense in a way that someone might be working on it. Since it was dark, I first called out and shone my flashlight around to alert of my presence. Right. So of course, now it starts giving U-turns into the twilight zone. Nothing. Silence. Because of the previously mentioned curve of the hangar, I can't directly see all the way to the end. So, what's a trooper to do than to climb one of the tanks and pull on the NVGs to get a clear idea? Just that actually. I climb up, clear the turret, and look down at the entire column. Again, nothing. No open turret hatches, no tools laid out. Silence. Except the noises start again. The wrench, the movement of unbolted, swinging armored skirts, the locking lugs of a turret hatch etc. Except this time further down the line. Further away from me. I crept down each hall trying to see something and trying not to break my neck. NVGs kind of play with your depth perception, moving from tank to tank. Still nothing. I remember quite well the thick feeling of dread and discomfort. Not because of fear I guess, but mostly of the illogical, impossible scenario of hearing things that just shouldn't be there. I eventually noped out of the hangar through the other door, having checked every spot and side room, between and under the tanks, and checked back with my mate. Told him the story, he kind of laughed it off, but refused to go check the hangar himself afterwards. Sorry if it lacks luster, but it always kind of stuck with me mostly because, as I mentioned, I know how things sound. When you've spent 5 months shooting, loading, cleaning, and servicing the things, you just have inner mechanisms that trigger on certain events. This was a one-time thing that I never really mentioned to my superiors, but it definitely was interesting. Coast Guard, old Navy tug, brought into service to the USCG. Had a ghost of a Navy guy who died in the bilge from gas. Fast forward to a new USCG mechanic trying to fix one of the batteries and wasn't getting it quite right. A guy on the batter next to him said, "No, you do it like this," and unscrewed a part, showing him how it was done. However, the other guy was in a Navy uniform, and we were at sea. He diapered shortly after talking. Lots of us had seen that Navy engineer in the past, but that particular coastie got off the boat at the next port call and refused to reboard. We left without him, not sure whatever happened, but he never came back to the ship. We also had the screams of a lady that would happen during late shifts. Enough that we always turned the boat's aft away from the direction of the screams in case it was a civilian in the water. No woman aboard this ship. We would light up that section of ocean with high-powered lighting, but there was never anything there. We were told not to log the events. Cop here. I had another officer at work meet up with me right after a call he was on. He said an elderly lady was insisting someone was getting into her mobile home and stealing things and moving them around when she was asleep or not home. This is the standard MO for dementia calls. They will insist, but the facts don't add up, and after talking to them for a while you start to realize they aren't all there. Well, she had called us before and was advised by the officer to take some measures to prevent it or disprove it, which she obliged. She screwed all her windows shut, changed the locks on the doors, and installed cameras inside. She even set an alarm with motion detectors in the house and slept in her locked bedroom where she could arm and disarm from there without leaving the bedroom. And she said they were still getting inside the home. So, the first thing I think at this part of the story is that it has to be dementia, because how would they get in now? That, or it's like those horror stories where a person is living in your attic. She has no attic though, so that's out. Well, he reviews the video, and you can see her leave and lock the front door. Then sure, someone's hand can be seen on the edge of one of the frames inside the home. He said after seeing that he tore the place apart, inside and out, but there was no way in or out, no signs of forced entry, and nothing missing from the home. He said he ended up not taking a report because he couldn't figure out how to write one without saying it was a ghost. I was never afraid of supernatural, but it was a strange year living there. When we visited the house for the first time, I felt this strange, unsettling feeling. I didn't want to live there, but I was 16 at the time, and I had no vote in the house my mom would choose, and it ended up being this one. Thankfully, it was a rental, so we could leave any time. There was an old blue trailer in the yard. The homeowner told us we could make any change to the house, but we could not touch the trailer ever. We never even went near it. It was old and filthy, and we didn't care for it. During the time that we lived there, a series of stuff happened that we couldn't really explain at the time, but like I said, I was never really afraid of supernatural. We would clean, and suddenly the floor would be covered in muddy dog feet. No dogs around. One night I want to change a lamp, standing on a ladder. The ladder tips over. I nearly hit my head on the sink. It was really close, but there was no reason for the ladder to tip over. In 1 year, our house gets hit by lightning 3 times, going front to back, breaking every single thing that was plugged into electricity. One of these times my brother was outside in the back, taking in some stuff he left outside, so it wouldn't get wet from the rain. Lighting hits and he gets ejected at least 3 meters through the air across the lawn, hits a fence and falls on the ground. Miraculously he shook but unharmed. One night I woke up having to use the bathroom. I get up and hear water running. So, I walked into the bathroom, nothing. I woke my mom, told her I heard water. She does too. We go downstairs, it's flooded, ankle high already. A pipe burst. Mind you, those pipes were replaced when we moved in as part of the agreement, so they were new. Another day I come home. We got a kitten. I found its head in the living room. Blood and nothing else. Looked like something ate it. It was horrible. For the longest time there was this girl who would walk in and out of the house. We usually only caught a glimpse of her, mostly heard her giggle. This was a friendly neighborhood, so we figured it was one of the neighbors' kids, who was curious and playing games. We let her be. For a long time after that nothing out of the ordinary happened, but we wanted out of the house. We found a new place, and while we were moving one of the neighbors came to ask if we needed help. He glances at the old trailer and says, "So that thing is still here, huh?" I told him we weren't allowed to touch it, asked him if he knew why. Since he was so interested in it I thought he might know. He told me the people who originally bought the ground to build the house lived in that trailer until the house was ready. They never finished it because the dad shot his 6 daughters and wife and then committed suicide. Because of some formalities the case was never closed, and the trailer was a crime scene, which made it illegal to take away or enter it. He continued, after those people died the house was bought by a dog breeder. He finished the house, and one night he wanted to change a lamp and his ladder tips over, hit his head on the sink and he died. To this day I am certain those 2 families and even the dogs were present in that house. Oh, I have a good one. As is normal, not actually a police officer myself, but I got this straight from the police officer involved. So, these 2 veteran police officers, let's call them Bob and Mike, respond to a 911 that lacked details on a nicer block in a neighborhood of a large city. They get to the house and are met by this older woman who was clearly an immigrant from one of the Caribbean islands, judging by her accent. She welcomes them in and politely tells them that she didn't make the call and alluded to having had previous issues with some of the local punk kids, so they probably made the call as a prank. So, Bob is not green by any standard and is pretty well educated for a police officer. Super rational guy who has faced absolute nightmares with unflappable stoicism. But if there isn't something about that house that's telling him to run and not look back. And there's no reason for it, the house isn't a mansion but it's clean and well kept. The woman is annoyed about the prank call but entirely cordial with them. There's no weird sounds or smells that suggest something is amiss. Still, he can't shake this feeling of unbridled terror. They eventually finish taking the report and leave. After they get into the car, Mike looks at Bob and says, "Damned, I'm so glad to be out of there. Place freaked me." Now, this worries Bob more because Mike, in addition to being a veteran police officer with time in the homicide department, was also some veteran of an elite military unit, whose name entirely escapes me at the moment, and all around him. That they both were independently freaked out was bizarre. Still, it's a big city and they have other stuff to worry about, so they get back to work. But leaving that feeling unaddressed didn't sit well with Bob. When he was on his own and had nothing pending, he went back to that neighborhood and found the block captain. Pro tip, if you want to know the details in a specific area, find the block captain. So, he asks her, "Hey, you know that Islander lady on your block?" The captain says, "Oh, you mean the witch?" And Bob is just like, "What? Remember those kids that were giving the homeowner a tough time?" Apparently one of the local punks threw a rock at her window not too long ago, before Bob and Mike visited. This, let's call him punk, basically acted like a prick when the woman confronted him. Witnesses say she swore he would regret it. That very night, Punk's parents rush him to the local hospital, which is actually a really phenomenal hospital despite the neighborhood. He's in massive pain for apparently no reason. The ER runs tests, he's in multiple organ failure and they have no idea why. None of their tests showed any reason a previously healthy teenager was just dying in front of them. Nothing poisonous, no injuries, etc. The staff valiantly worked to stabilize him, but nothing was working. At last, the parents went to the homeowner's place, threw themselves in front of her door, and begged her to spare their son. The homeowner supposedly looked at them with an oddly neutral face and said their son would be fine. Sure enough, for no reason that the hospital staff could fathom, Punk does a complete 180 during the night. All his organs start working again, he stabilizes, and is back to 100% come morning. There isn't even any permanent damage to his previously imperiled organs. Bob later confirmed at least Punk's mysterious illness and equally astounding recovery. Bob's contact was totally creeped out when he told her about the homeowner.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.